Thanks for leading this one.
Mhm. Hi, everyone. Welcome. We'll just take a few extra minutes to let people arrive. While you're waiting for us to get started, please feel free to drop in the chat where you're calling in from today. Nice to see some familiar faces. Hi, Tiana. Takumi. Good to have you all here. Great. All right. Well, thank you all so much for taking the time tonight. We hope you're excited for your first look at this year's thematic curriculum, Journalism in Armed Conflict. And I hope you're really excited to have Charles C. Maddie and Lena be presenting the curriculum. They are interns with our team this summer, all are in law school right now. And you can ask them really hard questions because they're experts. So whenever they are ready, we'll get started.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lena, and welcome to the lesson on journalism and armed conflict brought to you by the American Red Cross as part of the International Humanitarian Law Youth Action Campaign. In this module, you will learn how journalists interact with the military, what laws govern the treatment of journalists under international law, how those laws work using practical examples, how the buildings and infrastructure used by journalists are treated under international law, how social media intersects with international law, and how journalists' gender impact their experiences covering war. After this module, you will have mastered the ins and outs of international humanitarian law as it relates to journalism. So, what's a journalist? Journalists are storytellers. They go to places where most people cannot observe and report on events of importance and relate what happened back to the public. They play an important role in ensuring the public stays informed of events happening around the world. This, in turn, helps everyone make informed decisions in their day-to-day lives. They also keep the public informed by making information digestible, interesting, and entertaining. A journalist's job starts with gathering information. The process in the context of war can be dangerous and spontaneous. Journalists may not know exactly what they are looking for when they begin collecting information and can be surprised by what they find. Next, they process the information they have collected and turn it into a story that is ready for public consumption. Journalists organize and assess the information, ensure that it is true and accurate, and fits the narrative they are trying to portray. Finally, they disseminate the information, which can be done through a major media platform like the New York Times, which is an independent publication through a website, or any means in between. So, what is a military journalist? Well, there are three different types of journalists. Now, note that this term is not a technical term, but we will be using it to describe anyone who does journalistic work related to armed conflicts. The three types of military journalists are freelance military journalists or freelancers, war correspondents, and military press. The connection of journalism to the military is long-standing. It can be traced as far back as ancient Greece, when Homer told the story of the Iliad, a famous epic about the Trojan War. We can continue to see the war reporting in major conflicts throughout time, including Caesar's writings about the conquest of Gaul, paintings of Dutch naval battles, newspaper articles for the Napoleonic Wars, and military members reporting during the Civil War. As we get closer to the present, you may start to be more familiar with examples of military journalism. There was reporting during World War I that was often filtered through censorship. During World War II, Lee Miller famously covered the war for Vogue magazine. This was depicted in a 2024 film. The introduction of television news also greatly impacted the public's view of the Vietnam War. Journalists then played a major role covering the Iraq War. These examples show just how much military journalism has developed over time. Freelance journalists are not part of the military itself. They also do not work for a specific news outlet. They act on their own, choosing to report on war and the military. They may get paid by news organizations or other groups to report if their stories are deemed worthy of publishing. On this slide, you can see an example of a freelance journalist in the movie Civil War, which came out in 2024. This character is a war photographer who, in the middle of a fictional civil war in the United States, joins a group of journalists and takes photos of the war as she makes her way to the president to hopefully interview him. This dramatized version of a freelance war photographer is fictional, but provides a cool example of freelance journalists on screen. Now, war correspondents accompany the military, but they themselves are not members of the military. They are generally employed by news organizations and have been approved to accompany the military and are issued special ID cards. Here, you will see two examples of war correspondents in popular media. On the left is cinematic portrayal of Lee Miller, who we mentioned earlier in the history of military journalism. She was a war correspondent for Vogue and covered events like the London Blitz and the liberation of Paris during World War II. On the right is the movie Whiskey Tango Foxtrot, which is loosely based on the life of Kim Barker, a war correspondent who covered the war in Afghanistan. Both of these women accompanied the military in their professional capacity, reporting on the wars without actually serving in the military. Finally, the third type of military journalist is the military press. These journalists are actual members of the armed forces that serve primarily in a non-combat role, writing articles about and taking photographs of the military. We will show you an example of a military press member, but we'd first like to provide a trigger warning. The photograph on the next slide does depict graphic violence. This is Eddie Adams, who was a photojournalist and joined the United States Marine Corps during the Korean War as a combat photographer. But he is best known for winning the Pulitzer Prize for taking the photograph here. He did so while covering the Vietnam War as a war correspondent and not as a member of the military press. He shows how people can change between the various types of military journalists. So why do we need journalism in armed conflicts? Well, it's because these conflicts impact our lives and our society, and it's important that we have knowledge of what is happening so that we can make informed decisions. As a result, we rely on journalists to provide accurate and truthful accounts of what is going on during a conflict. Furthermore, military journalism has a role in influencing public opinion about the armed conflicts, which in turn can even impact the outcomes of the conflicts, or maybe more importantly, hold various parties accountable for their actions during wartime. Journalism can be fundamental for maintaining military integrity. Again, we will be showing the same photo from earlier depicting graphic violence, so here's another trigger warning for those of you who may need it. Eddie Adams, pictured here, was working as a war correspondent for the Associated Press when he took the now famous photo he is holding of the summary execution of an alleged Viet Cong operative. The story around this photo illustrates the power of military journalism and the impact it can have on conflict. When Adams took the photo, he felt the man doing the shooting was justified as the victim, had been accused of killing several children a short time before his execution. Several U.S. Marines had been asked to execute the man and refused. Rather than depicting a scene where Marines refused to violate the law of war, the public saw an American ally committing a brutal summary execution. This image turned public opinion away from supporting the Vietnam War. I will now turn this over to my colleague, Chelsea.
Thanks, Lena. So, there is a conflict of interest that journalists need to consider when reporting on the military and armed conflicts. So, they need to weigh the public's right to know what is going on against national security concerns. Basically, a journalist needs to recognize that there is a duty to tell the truth to the public, but at the same time, there may be a limit to what they are allowed to say. For example, there may be privileged or confidential information that the military cannot disclose for risk of impacting the safety and security of others. In these types of situations, journalists need to follow ethical guidelines. The international community has developed a robust legal framework to regulate military journalism and provide protections for journalists working in the field. Although there are some gaps and the laws aren't always that specific, they are still very useful and continue to apply to military journalists today. So we'll start with the first major piece of international law, the Third Geneva Convention, which provides information about prisoner of war status. And it was first adopted in 1929 before being significantly revised and coming to its modern iteration in 1949. The Geneva Conventions were followed by the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or the ICCPR, in 1966. The ICCPR provides an international legal framework for civil and political human rights, such as the freedom of expression and the right to provide and seek information. In 1977, we have the additional protocols. AP1 was introduced as an amendment to the Geneva Conventions concerning specifically the protection of civilians during international armed conflict. And finally, we have the United Nations. The UN Security Council introduced Resolution 1738 to provide further protection of civilians in armed conflict. So these laws do cover more than just military journalists, but they form the framework of legal protections afforded to those who report on armed conflict. So we can start with GC3, the Third Geneva Convention's Article 4, talks about prisoners of war, or POWs. So POW protections apply to lots of different kinds of people, but for the purposes of this module, it's important to know that POW status does apply to people accompanying armed conflicts who aren't, or excuse me, accompanying armed forces who aren't actually members of those forces. Article 4 explicitly includes war correspondents in this category as long as they've received permission from the armed forces they are accompanying. We also mentioned the ICCPR, a treaty adopted by the UN. Article 19 declares that people have the right to freedom of expression and opinion. So this obviously includes the freedom to provide and seek information through various forms of media, print, audio, such things like that. Obviously, all journalism. This right is subject to conditions and restrictions as necessary under applicable law, for example, protection of national security, as we discussed earlier. So note that this is not an example of IHL. This is actually an example of international human rights law, which applies outside and during wartime, whereas IHL, as you all know, only applies during wartime. But we wanted to give you an example of protection for journalists that exist under international human rights law. So Article 79 of AP1 details protections specifically for journalists. Journalists engaged in dangerous missions in armed conflict areas are considered civilians for all intents and purposes and therefore remain protected as civilians. This status can change if they act in some manner that removes their civilian status. So, for example, if a reporter were to directly participate in hostilities or DPH by picking up a gun and firing at opposing forces, they would lose their protected civilian status. Article 79 also mentions that journalists can obtain an ID card to mark them to indicate they're journalists while they engage in their professional activities. We have the UN Security Council resolution. This covers the protection of civilians in armed conflict and goes further than what's codified in the Geneva Conventions. It specifically denounces intentional direct attacks against journalists, as well as any persons associated with those journalists, and calls for all UN parties to stop engaging in such attacks and promise to prosecute anyone who does attack journalists in any such manner. So ultimately, the resolution aims to prevent any violations of IHL against civilians, including journalists, as long as they do not do anything to forfeit their protected status. So I know you all have talked about distinction before and are familiar with distinction, but let's just review this concept as it applies to journalism in the military. So distinction requires that parties to a conflict must distinguish between civilian populations and combatants, as well as between civilian objects and military objects. And then parties are only allowed to direct operations against military targets, combatants, and military objects. This functionally implies that indiscriminate attacks and the use of indiscriminate methods of waging war are prohibited at the risk of harming civilians. This is important to keep in mind as we talk about journalists because of their status as civilians. So when we classify the journalists as civilians versus combatants for distinction purposes, we look again to AP1. Freelance journalists and war correspondents, as Lena talked about earlier, are generally considered civilians under AP1. And military journalists will often have like press markings, wear these kind of vest jackets that help distinguish them to anyone else in the area as journalists and as protected individuals. However, these markings are not protective mechanisms the way the Red Cross emblem is, and they don't change the legal status of a journalist whether they're wearing it or not. The same with the ID cards; they can help identify journalists, but whether or not the journalist is carrying the ID card doesn't change the journalist's legal status. So we can do a quick review, and you can just drop your answer in the chat. So regarding civilian status for each of these different kinds of journalists, are freelance journalists civilians or combatants? And if you just want to drop a quick answer in the chat, that'd be great. Civilians or combatants? All right, awesome. We got 7 civilians answer. That is correct. Now moving on to war correspondents, are they considered civilians or combatants? Remember, war correspondents are journalists that are embedded with a military unit. So war correspondents are still considered civilians because they're not actually members of the armed forces, although they're accompanying the armed forces. And then finally, how about military press? So members of the military that do journalistic work, are they civilians or combatants? Yep, they are combatants because they are members of the military. So it doesn't matter what they're doing, they're legitimate targets. So, as we talked about earlier, a journalist can lose protected civilian status. So, how can that happen? As we talked about earlier, a journalist is protected from direct attack until they take action that is considered directly participating in hostilities. So, Article 51.3 of AP1 provides some insight into this, stating that civilians enjoy protection unless they take direct part in hostilities. So, this applies to journalists as well. And then, so we're going to talk a little bit about what constitutes direct participation in hostilities on the next slide. So according to the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, to qualify as directly participating in hostilities, an act must meet these 3 requirements. So first, the act is likely to adversely affect the military operations or capacity of a party to the conflict. So this is about the level of harm caused. Must meet a certain threshold of harm. Second, there has to be a direct causal link between the act and the harm. So the action taken by the individual was the reason the harm occurred. And then third, the act is specifically designed to cause this harm that occurred in support of a party to the conflict. So the person must have intentionally done this action to cause harm and did so in the hopes of harming one party, and benefiting another party to the conflict. So if an act meets all 3 criteria, then a civilian, and including a journalist who committed such an act, would lose their civilian status and they no longer be protected from direct attack. So does anyone have any thoughts about what could potentially constitute DPHing? Just drop in any examples you can think of in the chat, what kind of action would cause a civilian to lose their protected status. In just a few words. Yep, direct shooting at a combatant, directly attacking a combatant certainly could qualify. Joyce, yeah, oh, that's just to host and panelists. Also, everybody make sure that you're messaging everyone so that everybody can see your answers. But yeah, any acts, so attacking a military objective, maybe blow using weapons, sabotage, something like that could meet the threshold for DPHing, and then a civilian would no longer be protected from direct attack. Okay, Ashley, now next slide. Thank you very much. So another important IHL principle for journalists to keep in mind is prisoner of war or POW status. A prisoner of war is someone who is captured by opposing forces during an international armed conflict and is thus afforded certain protections under Article 13 of the Third Geneva Convention. All right, next slide. POW status can apply to journalists who are captured, but it kind of depends. War correspondents who are accompanying armed forces are entitled to POW status, even though they're civilians. So this is given under GC3, Article 4A4. Freelance journalists, however, that are not attached to military units are not entitled to POW status, but they also cannot be detained except for reasons of military necessity. And finally, members of the military press are members of the armed forces and are therefore entitled to POW status and all the protections that affords them. So we'll do a quick review. So if each one of these types of journalists was captured, would they be entitled to POW status? So would a freelance journalist be entitled to prisoner of war status? You can just drop your yes, no answers in the chat. Yep, no, definitely not. They're just kind of civilians acting in their own capacity, just happen to be reporting on the war. What about war correspondents? Do they get POW status? Yes, everybody's right. As previously discussed, they do get POW status, even though they are considered civilians. And then finally, about what about members of the military press? Yes, they do get civilian POW status because they are members of the armed forces. That one's pretty straightforward. Okay, so we're going to take these concepts and apply them to a series of hypotheticals, all starring this one incredibly unlucky person, Ernie. She's a member of the military. So in this first situation, she is just a member of the military. She doesn't work as a journalist. She's deployed overseas to the war, to a war. So um, I won't make you guys answer this. I think it's pretty obvious. She can be targeted by the enemy as a member of the armed forces. She is entitled to POW status. Just quick note, she does also get combatant immunity as a result of her status as a member of the armed forces, which means she cannot be put on trial for lawfully killing and injuring enemies, as well as she gets all the other protections afforded by POWs if she is captured. But now let's say Ernie is released and goes home and she decides to change career paths and goes to journalism school, but she has a hard time getting a job with a major media outlet and decides to just start covering the war on her own freelance. So she goes back overseas and is just taking pictures of what's going on. She comes across the same enemy soldiers who captured her the first time. Unluckily, they recognize her and wonder if they can target her. So if you're their legal advisor, tell them yes or no, can they target Ernie and when she's acting as a freelance journalist? Like, can they shoot and kill her? No, so there's a little bit of confusion on this one, but no, they cannot shoot and kill. They cannot directly target her because she's no longer a member of the military and she's a freelance journalist, which means she's considered a civilian and thus she's protected from direct attack, so long as she does not directly participate in the hostilities, which in this scenario she's not doing here. So she cannot be targeted. But of course, if she picked up a rifle and started shooting at them, they could shoot back. And then sorry, Ashley, I have one more question on the previous slide. Thank you. So what if she is detained by enemy forces, does she get POW status as a freelance journalist? Yes or no? All right, everybody's right. No, she does not get POW status. She is a civilian. Civilians are not entitled to POW status. They're still entitled to humane treatment, but they don't get paid. They don't get all these extra protections that POWs get. Okay, sometime later, Ernie is released. She goes home and she now gets hired by a major media outlet. So she gets assigned to be a war correspondent and she goes back overseas to the conflict. And yet again, she comes across the same battlefield and sees the same group of people. She's incredibly unlucky. And or maybe she's doing it on purpose. I don't know. Can the enemy target her in this situation as a war correspondent? She's functioning as a war correspondent. Correct. No, she's still a civilian. She's not a legitimate military target. Um, but does she get POW status in this situation if she's captured? Yep, everybody's right. That's the one difference. She does get POW status if she is captured. Finally, in this last scenario, we'll just come to Ernie again later in the presentation. But for now, the last scenario, let's say she gets out of POW custody and returns home, but just feels like tempting fate once again, and she joins the military again. As military press, she really comes full circle, and spends some time taking photographs for the military and is ordered to return to the same battlefield, sees the same enemy unit. You guys know the drill. Can she be targeted as a member of the military press? Yep, everybody's right. She can be. She's a member of the armed forces. She's a legitimate military target, no matter what she's doing. And of course, she does get POW protections because she is a member of the armed forces. Now, my colleague Maddie is going to continue talking about some other stuff.
All right, thanks, Charles. I'm going to be talking about the targeting of objects related to journalism. So we will move into a discussion of when journalistic buildings can be targeted under international humanitarian law. The principle of distinction applies to both objects and people. Military objects can be targeted under IHL. But what exactly is a military object? And many of you might know this, but a military object makes an effective contribution to military action by its nature, location, purpose, or action. So for example, if the military uses a military building to communicate information, that building can be targeted. It's targetable because it's military in nature. As with civilian people, objects that are for civilian use are protected from deliberate targeting or indiscriminate attack. But what exactly is a civilian object? Compared to a military object, a civilian object is an object without any military objective. Per our Additional Protocol 1, Article 52. Media facilities like radio stations, television studios, newspaper offices, and more are generally considered civilian objects unless they're used for military purposes. Media facilities may be targetable if they're used for military purposes. To further explore how a media facility can become a military objective, we'll briefly describe two international cases where the concept of targeting a military or civilian object was explored. The first case is Prosecutor versus Ferdinand Nahamana, Jean Bosco Barayagwiza, and Hassan Nzete. This case rose out of the 1994 Rwandan genocide, a tragic atrocity between the Hutu and Tutsi ethnic groups in Rwanda. During this conflict, a radio station called RTLM broadcast content that incited Hutu individuals to violence against the Tutsi ethnic group. Specifically, RTLM urged the Hutu population to defend themselves and use derogatory and inflammatory language. The International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda found the defendants guilty of incitement to genocide under the Genocide Convention for the radio broadcasts. This is because the radio broadcasts actively encouraged listeners to kill. The opinion further noted that the power of the media to create and destroy fundamental human values comes with great responsibility. Those who control such media are accountable to its consequences. A different case in a different tribunal, the International Criminal Court Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, expanded on the Rwanda case to further develop targeting principles as related to media facilities. The background of this case is as follows. In 1999, NATO launched a bombing campaign in the former Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, or FRY, to force FRY into granting Kosovo independence and ending human rights abuses. As part of this campaign, NATO targeted the Radio Television of Serbia, or RTS headquarters. NATO argued that RTS was a legal target because RTS was involved in Serbia's militaristic command, control, and communication network, or C3. As a result of the NATO targeting of RTS, there were 10 to 17 civilian casualties. The first question that the committee assessed in this case was, can a media facility be a legitimate military target? The committee asserted that if a media facility is used to incite crimes, then it is a legitimate target. The opinion referenced the previously mentioned decision in Rwanda. However, the committee also noted that if a media facility merely spreads propaganda to generate support for the war effort, it won't be a valid military target. Next, the committee turned to the specific facts of the case to determine whether the RTS facility was a legitimate military objective under IHL, given its dual civilian military function. Here, the committee found that targeting was permissible based on RTS contribution to the militaristic C3 network. Now let's talk about our favorite person, Ernie, and do another hypothetical. Ernie is a journalist in this scenario. Journalists at a television station reach out to Ernie. Another armed conflict is raging, and the television station wants to broadcast a call to action for listeners to take up arms against a rebel ethnic group. Can Ernie advise, how should Ernie advise the TV station? Will the TV station become a military target under IHL if they advise people to take up arms? You can answer yes or no in the chat. Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of people saying yes, so that's great. Yes, like the case in Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia, if you incite others to violence using media, then you can be held accountable under IHL, and you can be a legitimate military target. Now, looking to other, oh, we're good. Now, looking to other forms of media, social media is also an important part of journalism. I'm sure many of you have received news from a social media app in the past month. Maybe you've seen a TikTok on domestic politics, maybe an Instagram post about a foreign conflict. Ultimately, the popularization of social media has radically changed the way we communicate and learn about current events. More and more people are getting their news from social media sites like Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, and X. The rise of social media as a source of journalism poses some interesting legal questions for IHL. Civilians that are not journalists can use social media to transmit news about conflict, easily reaching millions of people. And as we've discussed, civilians are entitled to IHL protections. But can the use of social media in an armed conflict ever count as directly participating in hostilities, therefore causing a civilian to lose their protection? Let's discuss another Ernie situation. Oh no! After surviving several wars and developing her journalistic career, another war has broken out in Ernie's country. She can't catch a break. As the conflict rages on, patriotic civilians in her country start using the app ComPro to report and document the enemy's position during a foreign conflict. What are the legal implications of the civilian use of ComPro to report on enemy troop movements? If you guys have an idea of like what it would be, and let's remember that this is in the gray area, so you can say yes or no. If you want to give a reason why, that would be awesome. Okay, I'm gonna move on. Anyway, it's possible that the use of civilian use of ComPro to report enemy troop movements could be considered DPHing. However, it's a bit unclear in the current legal framework. Are the civilians directly participating in hostilities by using the app? Can they be targeted as a result? And does the use of civilian journalism create an issue with the potential spread of misinformation about the conflict? Is there any way to guard against the spread of misinformation? These are all questions that don't have a concrete answer yet under international humanitarian law, but I think they would be interesting to keep an eye on as social media continues to be a very influential way of spreading information in this day and age. IHL also has notable shortcomings and blind spots in its ability to address the gender dimensions of conflict, including the specific vulnerability of female victims. While IHL uses gender-neutral language, the Geneva Conventions were finalized in 1949. Some assumptions may therefore be outdated views about how men and women are affected by conflict. Female journalists, such as our friend Ernie, can face distinct challenges separate from their male counterparts while reporting in armed conflicts. Now, I'll ask you to think, and we don't have to put it in the chat. What are some of the particular considerations that female journalists should take into account while reporting? How do you think they're impacted or perceived differently from their male counterparts? And like I said, we can just take a minute to think on this, and you don't have to type it into the chat. All right, I hope a bunch of you thought maybe about different dimensions, like will they be respected by the military troops that they're being allowed to follow? Are they going to face cultural differences when they are abroad and trying to do their job? But that is all we have for you today. Before we part, we just wanted to leave you with some final review questions to think about after all the information we have learned. Now, these are going to be some yes, some no questions. You should be able to answer all of these in one word. So we'll just rapid fire them off. If you can put them in the chat, that would be awesome. Are freelance journalists afforded POW status? All right, nice work. The answer is no. Good job. Next, are embedded war correspondents civilians? You guys are on it. Good job. All right, and finally, how can a media facility lose its status as a protected civilian object? This is one or a couple words. inciting violence. Nice work, everyone. Okay. Well, thank you guys so much for your participation. We hope you guys learned something new about journalism and IHL.
Thank you all so much for joining us. If you have any questions, we can take them now. Preferably if you could put them into the Q&A box instead of the chat. It's a little easier for us to manage them there. Okay, not seeing any questions. Are you sure no one's got anything? All right. Well, thank you all for being here. We will be posting this recording up on our YouTube channel, and I hope that you're all really excited to use this curriculum to get ready for your campaigns next year. Have a great night.